If you're listening to this podcast today, I want to ask you to settle into a quiet, reflective place in your mind. What we're about to explore is not simply a crime, it is a collision between emotion and impulse, between fear and control, and between a person's outward facade and their hidden psychological landscape. My name is Richard, and as a psychologist who spent years studying the anatomy of violent decisions, I can tell you this: most acts of lethal violence are not committed by monsters. They're committed by people who found themselves standing on the edge of something they didn't know how to face, until they made a choice that changed everything. Today's story begins not in a courtroom, nor in a prison cell. It begins in something far more familiar: the quiet routines of a young mother navigating her work, her relationships, and the emotional storms we all face in private. A 26-year-old woman named Devon, a postal worker, a mother, someone whose life, at a glance, appeared unremarkable, made a decision that shattered multiple families and pulled an entire community into shock. But before we dive into the crime itself, I want to take us back into the fragments of her psyche, back into the chain of events that strengthened certain emotions while weakening others until the balance finally broke. Because every violent act has a psychological genealogy, a history, a chain. Devon's story begins with a breakup, something almost universal, almost mundane. She had been in a turbulent relationship with a man named Jason, the father of her young son. And as is often the case in relationships that end but never fully settle, emotional residue remained: bitterness, resentment, unresolved fears, unresolved hopes, and a constant questioning of oneself, of the former partner, of what could have been or should have been. Now, many people experience this. What makes Devon's case different is not that she felt abandoned or jealous or afraid she might lose her place in her son's life. What makes her story extraordinary is the way she responded when new information entered her psychological field. Jason had filed for increased custody, and perhaps even more destabilizing, he had begun a relationship with Devon's sister. Now pause with me for a moment and imagine what that feels like. Imagine the layers of betrayal her mind would have cataloged. Not only a romantic partner moving on, but moving on with someone inside the inner circle of family, someone whose very presence is supposed to echo trust, safety, and loyalty. When betrayal cuts through two relationships at once, the psychological effect is amplified. The mind begins scrambling for fixed points, anything that might restore a sense of order. But Devon's internal world was already fragile. Colleagues would later describe her as someone who oscillated between emotional numbness and intense reactivity. That pattern often signals unresolved trauma or chronic stress, or a deep sense of powerlessness. I tell my students this all the time. When a person already feels they have lost control of their own internal narrative, the threat of losing something external, like custody of a child, can strike like a psychological earthquake. It shakes loose feelings that had been stored and ignored. It shakes loose desperation. And that is where our story truly begins, in the emotional aftershocks following two pieces of news that Devon was not prepared to process. The morning of the murder began like any other for the postal workers in her Colorado community. Mail trucks rumbled out of their lot, scanners beeped as packages were logged, and carriers followed their predictable routes. But for Devon, nothing was predictable. Inside her chest was a storm she had no language for. And inside that storm was a decision she would act upon just hours later. 5 hours before she entered an interrogation room, shaken and attempting to anchor herself in righteous indignation, Devon drove to the area where Jason was delivering mail. She brought a weapon. She brought a plan. And she brought an emotional state that had long since broken free from rational control. Now understand this carefully. People do not commit violence simply because they're angry. Anger on its own, without justification, belief systems, emotional history, and a trigger, rarely becomes deadly. Violence erupts at the intersection of emotion and meaning. That is, emotion fueled by the meaning one attaches to a situation. If Devon believed she was losing her child, if she believed she was being betrayed by her sister, if she believed Jason was endangering her future as a mother, if she believed she was out of options, then the meaning forged in her mind might have been something like, "They're taking everything from me. I need to take control back." This is the seed from which violence grows. And so she drove. She parked. She waited. She approached Jason on his route, and she pulled the trigger 3 times. Now, I want you to hold that image lightly, not as a sensational moment, not as a true crime highlight, but as a psychological pivot, a moment where a human being crossed an internal boundary that can never be uncrossed. When the police arrived later, they found something Devon believed would protect her, her work scanner, abandoned far from the scene. In her mind, it was an alibi, a form of digital misdirection. But the world she lived in was not the world of 20 years ago. Cameras were everywhere, on street corners, on houses, in businesses, even on dashboards. And cameras are indifferent to human emotion. They record, they observe, they testify. Within hours, investigators found footage of Devon's personal car, noticeable for its missing front passenger hubcap, just blocks from the crime scene. They saw her running. They saw her returning to her car. They saw enough to establish a timeline that contradicted every alibi she would later try to verbalize. Which brings us to perhaps the most psychologically fascinating part of this case, the interrogation. Because what Devon does when she enters that room is both strategic and deeply revealing. She doesn't walk in crying or panicked. She doesn't walk in owning fear or confusion. She walks in angry. Angry, she claims, about her son being taken out of school without her consent. Now, to the untrained eye, this might look like misdirection, but to a psychologist, it is a coping mechanism. Anger is easier to inhabit than guilt. It is easier than fear. It is easier than staring directly into what one has done. Anger provides structure. Anger provides a target. Anger provides a narrative. And so that is the narrative she clung to. The detective, however, was not moved. He had already seen the evidence. He had already formed his hypothesis. And crucially, he had nothing emotionally invested in Devon's performance. Interrogations are rarely about shouting or intimidation. They're more often quiet, methodical, psychological chess games. And the detective in this case had no interest in playing patiently. His frustration was palpable. His sarcasm was deliberate. His direct accusations were unfiltered. Every time he confronted Devon with the growing mountain of evidence, she dodged. Every time he pointed to her car on camera, she pivoted to her indignation about school pickup procedures. Every time he asked her to explain the impossible, she offered only fragments of denial. This behavior, this clinging to an alternate emotional reality, is common among suspects who are psychologically overwhelmed. The mind is trying to preserve itself, to preserve an identity, to preserve an image of who one believes one still is, despite the enormity of what they've done. Devon wasn't ready to admit to herself what she had done, and so she could not admit it to anyone else. We'll continue in part 2 by diving deeper into the interrogation, into Devon's psychological defense mechanisms, and into how detectives interpret deceptive behavior from a behavioral science perspective. In my years studying human behavior, I've seen dozens of cases where a person walks into an interrogation room with a ready-made emotional script. They think if they just perform convincingly enough, if they cry or plead or demand something loudly and urgently, the room will bend to their emotional gravity. But here's what many people misunderstand. Police interrogators don't react to emotion. They react to strategy. And in Devon's case, her emotional outburst wasn't read as genuine panic. It was read as misdirection, a frantic attempt to center the conversation on something, anything other than the reason she was actually sitting in that room. The detective, whether intentionally or instinctively, does not reward her emotional performance. And that is the moment, right there, where the psychological unraveling truly begins. When Devon keeps insisting, "Where is my son? Why wasn't I contacted? My rights were violated." She believes she's creating distance between herself and the crime. She believes that fear over her child's whereabouts will reposition her in the detective's mind as a victim of police mishandling, not a potential suspect in a homicide. But here's the psychological catch. When someone is genuinely terrified about a child's safety, their voice cadence changes, their breathing changes, their priorities shift. The conversation becomes laser focused on the child. Is he hurt? Is he scared? Can I see him now? Devon, however, never expresses concern for her son's emotional or physical state. Her anger is procedural. Why wasn't I contacted? Why didn't you call me? It is anger about process, not protection. And that difference is enormous. As a psychology professor, I teach my students that emotion has intent. It has direction. It has purpose. For example, genuine fear moves inward. It narrows the world around you. You tremble. You breathe shallowly. You cling to what you love. But Devon's fear moves outward. It lashes, deflects, argues, moralizes. Instead of seeking safety, she seeks control. And control is often the first thing people grab when they feel the truth closing in. The detective senses this immediately, even if he doesn't articulate it in psychological terms. He meets her emotional intensity with flatness, almost indifference. It's a surprisingly effective tactic, because when you expect a stage, a spotlight, an emotional duel, and instead you get a wall, you start to lose your footing. And Devon does, over and over. When he breaks the news that Jason is dead, she reacts with shock, but the shock is structured, almost curated, not the wild, disoriented grief that accompanies real-time tragedy, but a momentary vacuum followed by an immediate return to the same fixation. Why was my son taken? Even here, her emotional compass does not swing toward the loss of her child's father, only the procedural inconvenience surrounding it. And the detective notices. Now, here's something subtle that I want you to appreciate because it's one of the most revealing elements of this entire case. Devon tries to maintain a psychological anchor that keeps the conversation in her control. Her anchor is this: I am the wronged mother. I am the one whose rights were ignored. Focus on that, not the crime. In interrogation psychology, we call this a distraction anchor. If a suspect can get the investigator to emotionally align with the suspect's grievance, it creates rapport, sympathy, and potentially a shift in how the investigator interprets the suspect's behavior. But Devon's mistake here is profound. She picked the wrong detective. This detective does not soothe. He does not placate. He does not reorient himself around her emotional display. He remains cold. He remains blunt. He remains slightly sarcastic even. And that causes Devon's emotional anchor to fail repeatedly. There is a moment
one of the most psychologically revealing in the entire interrogation, where the detective reveals the evidence: the car captured on cameras, the missing hubcap, the timeline, the proximity, and Devon freezes. Not a shocked freeze, not a defensive freeze, but the freeze of someone whose mental strategy was never built to withstand direct confrontation. Her emotional weight was entirely on the performance, never the facts. And when she's forced to confront facts, she cannot do it. Instead of asking, "What footage?" Instead of asking, "Are you sure it's my car?" Instead of attempting an alibi, she tries to pivot back to postal scanning procedures. She tries to talk about work protocols, scanner behavior, the logistics of package delivery. It's a disassociation maneuver, a step sideways out of the threat zone. But it's transparent, because no innocent person, when shown video evidence of their vehicle near a murder scene, says, "Well, according to postal scanning guidelines," they say, "What? How? That's impossible." But Devon can't say it, because she knows it isn't impossible. Now let's talk about something deeper, something I've spent years studying: the psychology of being cornered. When people are cornered psychologically, when they feel truth pressing against the walls they've built, one of two things usually happens. They collapse. The emotional scaffolding falls apart and the confession spills out. Tears, regret, panic, anything that comes from the sudden collapse of denial. Or they entrench. The mind builds a thicker shell. The person clings to fragments of argument, to semantics, to imagined loopholes. Devon entrenches. Her brain looks for anything it can grab. "I didn't turn the scanner off. I don't know why my car would be there. Someone must have borrowed it. I was on my route. I need a lawyer." Notice the sequence. First denial, then confusion, then logistical excuses, then legal recourse. It's a slow retreat, one step at a time into the bunker of self-preservation. And the detective? He watches all of this. He doesn't buy the anger. He doesn't buy the denial. He doesn't buy the logistical explanations. He sees something that inexperienced interrogators often miss. When a suspect's emotional performance stops matching the gravity of the situation, it's because they're managing guilt, not shock. Think about that. When a person is confronted with unexpected tragedy, their emotional reaction is chaotic. It spikes, it drops, it oscillates between confusion, grief, unbelief. But Devon's emotional state is remarkably consistent, steady, reusable, performed, and performance is the enemy of truth. What we are seeing in this interrogation room is the slow erosion of a constructed identity. She walked in thinking she could hold the narrative, but the narrative is slipping from her hands. The detective is not cooperating with her emotional cues. He does not validate her fears. He does not comfort her. He does not join her on the psychological stage she built. And when someone is denied their stage, their performance eventually cracks. Not always visibly, but internally. As we move further in this case, we'll see that Devon's strategy doesn't just fail, it fails spectacularly. We'll also explore why she believed this plan could work, how cognitive stress reshapes memory and storytelling, the psychological illusion of control during crisis, and how guilt changes the brain's decision-making pathways. But for now, I want you to hold on to this central idea. People reveal themselves not in their stories, but in the gaps between their stories and reality. And Devon's gaps are widening by the minute.
When we left off, Devon was boxed in by evidence, boxed in by the detective's confidence, and boxed in by her own narrowing psychological escape routes. And now, As we step into the next section of this unfolding interrogation, I want you, listeners, to pay attention to something subtle but profoundly important. What a guilty mind does when it runs out of places to hide. Because every human mind, when confronted with overwhelming cognitive dissonance, especially when guilt is involved, tends to fall back on one last refuge: emotional misdirection, an appeal to sympathy, a plea for understanding, a sudden vulnerability that may or may not be genuine. And in Devon's case, you're about to hear that defense mechanism begin to crack and shift in real time. Detectives, especially seasoned ones, know exactly when a suspect is starting to lose grip on the false narrative they've been clinging to. One of the most telling signs is verbal fragmentation. Speech becomes disjointed, reasoning becomes circular, and the suspect begins leaning heavily on emotional argumentation instead of factual contradiction. This is what we begin to see in Devon after the detective confronts her with the images of her car. Her response, if we can even call it that, is inertia. She sits still, barely moves, doesn't blink much, does not offer a denial, does not ask what video, does not counter-argue the timeline. She simply freezes. Now, why? Why would someone freeze instead of deny? Well, because denial requires a plan, and Devon's plan was already in flames. Her original defense strategy hinged entirely on anger about her son, distraction through emotional upheaval, deflection through procedural complaints. But none of that works when you are confronted with video evidence, GPS data, behavioral inconsistencies, witness statements. So when Devon froze, she wasn't calculating. She was experiencing what we call a psychological stall, a moment where the brain stops producing viable escape routes. It's similar to when a computer crashes because too many contradictory inputs overwhelm the system. After that moment of stillness, Devon tries one more card, what we often call the legal panic move. She invokes the idea of a lawyer. But here's the thing. People who request lawyers for legitimate self-protection tend to do so calmly, or at least logically. Devon's invocation is neither of those. She frames it as, I don't know if I should get a lawyer. I don't know what to say. Maybe I need to ask for one. I'm not sure. This is not a person who has prepared a legal defense. This is someone testing whether the detective will panic or back off. But he doesn't. And that's when Devon's tone changes again. Listeners, this is the point where guilt begins to bleed through the seams. There is a cult class phrase in interrogation psychology. When the truth is too dangerous, the guilty switch to vagueness. And Devon becomes very vague very quickly. She begins responding to straightforward evidence with, I don't know. Maybe someone borrowed my car. I was working. Why would I shoot him? I don't know why the scanner did that. None of these explanations address the detective's direct questions, but more importantly, none of them challenge the specific elements of the accusation. For example, she never says, I wasn't near that area. That's not my car. You have the wrong footage. Instead, she adopts a kind of fog-like uncertainty. This is a tactic, conscious or unconscious, used by guilty suspects who want to avoid lying outright, but also cannot tell the truth. It's the psychological space between confession and denial. We see it constantly in criminology, particularly among suspects who did not pre-plan their interrogation story, which in Devon's case is very evident. Now, for those listening carefully, the detective's demeanor shifts too. Early in the interrogation, he leans into sarcasm. He toys with her emotional theatrics. He treats her diversion as exactly what it is, an act. But as the evidence piles up, he changes tone. His voice flattens. His questions sharpen. His focus narrows like a laser. Why is your car there? Why is your scanner stationary? Why did you lie about where you were? Why does the shooter look like you? He drops all pretense of small talk and moves toward what we call the triangulation stage of interrogation, pinning down her statements into a corner. Now, what Devon does next is fascinating. Instead of defending herself, she pivots to moral argumentation. Why would I shoot him? Why would I do that? There are other things I could have done. This is what we call reverse rationalization, a suspect explaining why they shouldn't have committed the crime rather than explaining why they didn't. It's a major psychological tell. In nearly all interrogations, there is a tipping point where the suspect's internal narrative collapses. For Devon, this occurs when she starts insisting, I don't know why my car was there. I don't know why that happened. I don't know what the video shows. This helpless surrender posture serves a few purposes. One, it shifts the emotional workload onto the detective. The guilty person wants the detective to do the hard work of concluding guilt so they don't have to say the words themselves. Two, it allows the suspect to stay in denial without presenting a coherent alternative. In psychological terms, it reduces cognitive dissonance. Three, it gives the suspect emotional wiggle room if confronted by irrefutable evidence. They can claim panic, confusion, trauma, misunderstanding. It's a soft pillow to fall on, a way for the mind to avoid fully confronting the reality of what it has done. But detectives, especially ones like this, have seen it hundreds of times, and they don't buy it. If you listen closely to his tone, he is no longer interrogating, he is summarizing. Summarizing is what detectives do when they believe the case is already airtight. He says, the gig is up. We know it's you. Your car was there. The shooter matches your build. We are seizing your car. We are searching your home. This is not a discussion anymore. It is a declaration. And Devon, for the first time, reacts with something approaching fear. Her voice wavers. Her eyes flicker. Her emotional posture shifts from anger to uncertainty. This is the moment where the psychological facade begins to fully collapse. A lot of people assume that silence in an interrogation is a sign of innocence. That is incorrect. Silence can mean many things, but in cases like this, silence appears when the suspect's lie has been cornered. The suspect loses control of the narrative. The suspect mentally acknowledges guilt. The suspect is afraid of adding more incriminating detail. The suspect shuts down to avoid confession. For Devon, her silence after the detective pointed to the surveillance footage is incredibly revealing. It is the silence of someone who realizes, suddenly, that the alibi they hoped would save them has already been dismantled. Her brain is recalculating. Her emotions are recalibrating. Her options are evaporating. And remember, this is a suspect who planned the shooting. She plotted the timeline. She coordinated movements with her boyfriend. She believed she could outsmart the investigation. When someone who considers themselves clever is confronted with evidence, the shock internally is far greater, because for the first time, the cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable. Now, I want to step back for a moment and talk about the scanner. For those who might not be familiar, USPS postal scanners function like mobile GPS trackers. They log movement, time, location, operational status. Devon believed, incorrectly, that leaving her scanner idle near her boyfriend's home would create a working alibi. But here's what she didn't account for: CCTV capture, license plate readers, timeline reconstruction, video triangulation, work route mapping, scanner inactivity flags, witnesses noticing her absence. She underestimated every modern investigative tool available. This is incredibly common among impulsive offenders. When someone commits a crime in the haze of emotion rather than logic, they tend to rely on one single clever idea, something they believe makes them untouchable.
But psychological blind spots are dangerous, especially when mixed with jealousy, fear, rejection, custody disputes, and profound emotional instability. I want listeners to understand something important. Crimes like this, intimate partner homicides, almost never occur suddenly. They build, they simmer, they accumulate psychological pressure over months or even years. When people feel replaced, betrayed, abandoned, threatened, powerless, they sometimes erupt. That eruption becomes the crime scene, but the eruption rarely appears.
But the eruption rarely appears from nowhere. And in Devon's case, the trigger was a perfect storm. Custody anxiety, loss of relational control, jealousy involving her own sister, perceived humiliation, emotional instability, fear of losing her child, conflict with her ex, romantic influence from her boyfriend. All of these factors stew inside the psyche until eventually the emotional dam breaks. We are not just observing a crime here, we are observing a psychological implosion, and that implosion left a man dead on his postal route. When I think back on Devon's behavior in those final moments of the interrogation, what strikes me most is the almost eerie stillness she maintained. Not the calm of innocence, but the rigidity of a person whose psychological scaffolding has begun to collapse. It's the kind of stillness you see when someone is attempting to hold together a reality that's disintegrating around them. To a trained eye, it's a clear sign of internal panic, even when the face looks composed. And the detective, by this point, had run out of patience. Procedurally, he had done most of what he needed to do. Emotionally, he seemed ready to move on. You can almost hear it in the way he breathed, the way his sentences clipped off early. In his mind, this case was solved. It was time to move from dialogue to the inevitable conclusion. But to understand what happens next, and why it unfolds the way it does, we have to consider something important. Devon had spent the entire interrogation clinging to a single psychological strategy: avoidance. And avoidance works until the moment it doesn't. By now, she had realized that every escape route she tried had collapsed. The story about her son being taken from school? It didn't shift the detective's focus. The emotional performance, the indignation, the moral outrage? It didn't sway him in the slightest. Her insistence that she was at work? Undercut by scanner data and CCTV footage. Claims of confusion? Ineffective against a detective who simply wasn't buying it. When people who rely on avoidance strategies finally run out of room to avoid, one of two things usually happens. They confess because the internal pressure becomes unbearable. They shut down, falling into a kind of defensive emotional paralysis. Devon chose the second path. Her breathing slowed, her posture tightened, her answers shrank to fragments. She no longer fought the detective. She simply waited for something, anything, to shift the responsibility away from her. But psychology offers no escape from evidence. When the detective finally asked her to stand, to turn around, and extend her hands for cuffs, the room seemed to exhale. Everything that had been simmering suddenly cooled. There's a feeling in interrogation rooms at this moment, a strange combination of relief and dread. Investigators feel relief because the case is moving toward closure. The suspect often feels dread because the future is now fixed. Devon asked the question almost everyone asks just before the cuffs go on. Am I being arrested? It's not really a question about legal status. It's a question about identity.
A question about whether the version of yourself you've carried your entire life has just shattered. Because once a person is told they're under arrest for murder, the world rewrites them in real time. Their past, their future, their relationships, all of it is reshaped in the context of that label. The detective avoids the question, standard procedure in many departments, until formal arrest is declared. But psychologically, the answer has already been delivered. Later, evidence would show something crucial. Devon and her boyfriend planned the murder. This wasn't spontaneous or impulsive. It was coordinated. Her boyfriend followed Jason's vehicle, feeding her real-time information. She knew where he'd be, when he'd be alone, and what route he would take. People often ask me, but if it was planned, why did she behave the way she did in the interrogation? Why didn't she remain silent? Why didn't she lawyer up immediately? There are three answers to that. 1. Overconfidence in her alibi. Leaving the postal scanner miles away wasn't clever, it was naive. But in her mind, it felt airtight. Criminals often dramatically overestimate the strength of digital decoys. 2. Magical thinking. Avoidance-heavy personalities often believe that if they simply deny something hard enough, the world will rearrange itself around the denial. 3. Emotional collapse. Once her son was taken into protective custody, her psychological center of gravity shifted. She wasn't thinking like someone managing a crime. She was thinking like someone terrified of losing the one thing that connected her life to meaning. And that's how cognitive dissonance takes over. You can hold a mountain of contradictory ideas in your mind as long as they protect you from unbearable truths. Jason's murder wasn't done in isolation. Devon's boyfriend, angry, possessive, equally impulsive, was the one who shadowed Jason's route. He was the eyes and ears of the operation, the one feeding Devon the details she needed. This is not uncommon in cases driven by jealousy, spite, or custodial disputes. One individual is the emotional catalyst, the other becomes the operational engine. Together, they form what criminologists call a co-dysfunctional dyad, a pair whose worst traits amplify each other. And dyads like these almost always collapse under scrutiny, because mutual reinforcement falls apart the moment consequences become real. Partners turn on each other, stories diverge, loyalty evaporates. That happened here as well. Messages were recovered, deleted ones, coordinating the killing. They sealed both of their fates. People often assume premeditated killers are calculating masterminds, but most are not. Most are ordinary individuals who let anger sit too long without resolution. They let resentment ferment until it becomes something toxic. Premeditation is not always the result of intelligence. It can also be the result of prolonged emotional instability. In Devon's case, the triggering events stacked up. The custody filing, the new relationship with her sister, the fear of losing her son, long-standing resentment, a boyfriend who encouraged retaliatory thinking. Each factor alone is manageable. Together, they form a psychological avalanche. At some point, Devon crossed a threshold, a point where her emotional storm inside her was stronger than her ability to regulate it. Once a person crosses that line, all their moral boundaries shift. In her mind, she wasn't destroying a life. She was fighting for one. That's the most dangerous kind of cognitive distortion. The detective, after finishing the forensic logistics, stepped aside while other officers processed the room. Devon stood quietly. There's a certain silence in rooms like that, part resignation, part disbelief. She had spent hours insisting on her innocence, clinging to every excuse she could generate. But once the cuffs go on, people often lose the ability or the desire to maintain the facade. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stared downward, a subtle deflation of the shoulders, breathing shallowly, the body's way of accepting an outcome it can no longer negotiate. And yet, here is the fascinating part. She still didn't confess. That's not stubbornness. It's not even deception at that point. It's identity preservation. To admit guilt would require acknowledging not only that she took a life, but that she destroyed her son's world, condemned herself to a lifetime behind bars, and betrayed every value she once claimed to hold. Some truths are too catastrophic to speak aloud. Ultimately, both she and her boyfriend received life sentences without parole. Forensic evidence, text messages, vehicle data, and investigative timelines created a timeline so airtight that there was no room left to maneuver. But even in sentencing hearings, Devon maintained an air of bewildered indignation, still leaning on the emotional posture she displayed in the interrogation room. Psychologically, she may carry that posture for years. Some never let go of it. A story told long enough becomes the narrator's truth. But this is where the story takes a turn, because what follows is not about Devon at all, but about Amber, another case entirely. Cases like these often bleed into one another inside police stations, courtrooms, and social memory.
As a psychologist, I encounter them in sequences that force me to observe patterns across individuals who will never meet, yet whose psychological arcs share eerie similarities. Amber's case, another example of emotional volatility meeting violent resolve, offers a striking contrast to Devon's. Where Devon hid behind emotional indignation, Amber fluctuated between dissociation, confession, and moments of dark levity. And in examining Amber, we'll see another version of the same core truth. When unresolved trauma, fear, and anger accumulate, the human mind sometimes chooses destruction over vulnerability. In the next episode, we'll explore Amber's story in depth, her shifting memory, her fluctuating emotional states, and the psychology behind her violent eruption. And through her, we'll gain deeper insight into why certain individuals choose violence when they feel cornered, threatened, or unheard. But for now, let's close this chapter of Devon, because understanding her psychology gives us the foundation we need to understand what comes next.